John. I'm a certified soundtrack maniac. Been collecting soundtracks for many years, since I was a young boy, particularly Italian film soundtracks. So we're going to have a discussion about the 1970 Italian thrilling film Forbidden Photos of a Lady Under Suspicion. Music by the maestro Ennio Morricone. Now, a lot has been talked about, written, discussed about the maestro, but also I'm going to be talking specifically about the key players and musicians who collaborated with him on this soundtrack. Throughout the years, you know, Morricone is the most well-known Italian composer, film soundtrack composer out there, and he is a genius. There's no two ways about that. However, never underestimate the musicians who performed with him, and particularly during this period that the film was made. So you have Ennio Morricone, you have Bruno Nicolai, and you have Alessandro Alessandroni. You put these three guys together on a soundtrack, some fucking dynamite's going to be happening. There's an end of story, basically. And their greatest period together, the three of them as a triage, was from the Dollars films straight through to, I would say, the mid-70s. That was, to many people, a golden period of Italian film soundtracks when these three guys were on the case. So let's just have a quick chat about their relationship. Why is, how come, you know, when they work together, how come we've got this particularly strong and resonant, potent soundtrack history at this time? Well, first and foremost, Morricone and Alessandro were childhood friends, and they always kind of stayed in touch. Now, when A Fistful of Dollars was being made, you know, Ennio contacted Alessandro and he needed a whistle. And he thought of Alessandro because Alessandro had already performed a very haunting whistle for the great composer Nino Rota. So Alessandro was on board there straight away. And then you have Bruno Nicolai, who studied and met Ennio Morricone at the Santa Cecilia Conservatory in Rome. They met each other while Nicolai was studying piano and composition, and Morricone was studying trumpet, which is actually his music of choice. So basically you have Morricone, who is a trumpet player for all intents and purposes. You have Nicolai, who is a piano player for all intents and purposes. And you have Alessandro, who is a multi-talented musician. He played many instruments. Not only could he compose and conduct, he could play guitar, he could play mandolin, accordion, sitar. It's endless. I think the only instrument that Alessandro couldn't play was drums. Everything else he was pretty full on with. So you have these three guys together with a long history, obviously all collaborating from the Dollars movies, and for all intents and purposes they congealed, these three, and they're always feeding off each other. So you basically have the three of them coming from kind of different musical spaces. You know, Morricone was coming from the avant-garde. He'd learnt about German serialism from one of his collaborators, Franco Evangelistini, who was a founder member of Il Gruppo, the improvisational group that Morricone played alongside with on many projects, including quite a few Giallo scores, including most famously The Cold Eyes of Fear, which is a fucking wild soundtrack and just totally off the hook. That's a soundtrack now that's, you know, very highly thought of. I can tell you, back in the days of soundtrack collecting in the 70s and 80s, most Morricone purists would pretty much spit at that soundtrack, but now obviously it's now known as a classic. So Morricone brought that to the table. He brought that kind of that serialism to the scores. Morricone, biggest skill, and actually his trump card that both Nicolai and Alessandro did utilise for themselves on their own releases, their own soundtracks, was the serialism, the Germanic influence, the detuning of instruments. Morricone was a whiz at doing that. he would go around and he would detune everybody's instruments, and it would all just sound completely bonkers and different to what they had. I mean, Alessandro was a great friend of mine. I worked with him, and he was a dear personal friend. So I'm lucky enough to have, you know, first-hand accounts of the studio practices. That was one of them that Alessandro always told me, that everyone was really blown away by how Ennio Morricone could go around, detune everyone, and he had these crazy thoughts in his head, you know. And you have to remember, you know, Alessandro came from a more traditional jazz background. You know, so Alessandro learnt a lot from Morricone on that one. So we have to remember that Nicolai used his own form of compositional serialism for his own scores, including, you know, the score to All the Colours of the Dark, for instance, the Sergio Martino kind of classic Jarlai. So everyone was kind of feeding off each other, and I think what's happened is, because Morricone's at the top of the tree, these guys get forgotten about, and I really can't emphasize enough the importance of these two incredible musicians that played alongside Morricone. Yes, they took from Morricone, but by God did Morricone take from them. There's a lot of scores in Morricone's name, and I swear to God, you know, it should be under Bruno Nicolai. And I'll say this for a few reasons. Now, the first reason is that you look at most soundtrack releases now with Morricone's name on it, it will say conducted by Morricone. It's pretty much nonsense. It would have been conducted by Nicolai, no two ways about it, 9 times out of 10. And it's a shame that Bruno Nicolai doesn't get the props, and I think he should, because he was a genius composer, particularly of orchestras. They shared a lot of duties, let's just put it that way, trying to find out who did what and who played on what. When these guys were in the studio knocking these soundtracks out, it's an impossible task. And, you know, my many conversations with Alessandro, you have to remember when I worked with Alessandro, which was in the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, Alessandro was in his 70s then anyway, you know, mid to late 70s. You can't, you know, ask him to remember all those years ago who did what and what was going on. I mean, this guy was working, you know, his fucking brains out. These guys were working round the clock. I think it's incredible, really, when you look at it and you look at the musicians back then, particularly Morricone and Nicolai and Alessandro. They knew what the hell they were doing and how on point they were for all these soundtracks. How do you, you know, keep with it? How do you keep on point for all these soundtracks that they were knocking out every day? You know, Alessandro used to tell me that they'd have beds in the studio. He never saw his family, nor did Nicolai for that matter. They set up beds. The workload was so much that they were just knocking everything out completely. You know, Alessandro said that one of his biggest regrets was he didn't see his children grow up. And he made up for that in later life. But at the time, it was just work, basically. These guys were knocking soundtracks out like you know, at amazing speed. So, you know, you've got to tip your hat to these guys alone for the quality that we had back then. So basically, you've got the big three, okay? And I'm going to call them the big three throughout the talk because you know who they are now. So we have one more player in this soundtrack, okay? And that will be the great Edda D'Alorso, the Queen. Edda is perhaps the most famous of Alessandro's singers, part of his octet, which was the Modern Singers of Alessandroni. They began in 1962. Basically, they were doing work for RCA Italia. They were formed predominantly for RCA Italia, actually, and for soundtracks, but predominantly library work. Alessandro put the singers together. He was their arranger. It comprised of Edda from very early on. Edda was one of the early members, and more members joined. Another member I must mention also, who doesn't actually perform any vocals on the soundtrack, but I think is very, very important, is Julie Mutis, which is Mrs. Alessandroni, who was an incredible vocalist and arranger and musician herself. When she was working with Alessandro, they would go under different names. Alessandro was known as Brain, she was known as Kima, and we had Raskovich, who was Giuliano Sorghini. Horror fans will know Giulio Sorghini for his amazing soundtrack to The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue. But again, when you get those three together, you know, fucking watch out. when you got those three together, you know, bringing out all their library albums and stuff, particularly as the Pawn Shop, next level. And people are only just sort of catching up with really the work that trio were doing. Anyway, we'll get back to the big three and we'll get back to Edda. Edda is obviously the most famous because she was a soprano. All the other singers, like Julia, had a different style. You had another singer who was part of the modern singers, Peter Boom. He was a German. He did a lot of spaghetti westerns. He had a great booming voice. And Alessandro would use all these singers as he felt would be right for the soundtrack. And of course, Edda was a natural. She had this incredible soaring voice, and she basically, there were wordless vocals, there were scat, very much from jazz really, but with classical too. And she's obviously on the soundtrack to the movie as well. It's worth pointing out that Edda was quite a petite lady with an incredible range, vocal range and vocabulary, who could really belt it out. Alessandro told me a story once of Edda when they were recording Once Upon a Time in the West, and the main theme, the romantic theme, they all had to hold her up because she was just so on the case and belting this track out. They were all behind her as she belted out this incredible aria, you know, so incredible really. So obviously Edda's used on the soundtrack. She's another key player. But again, I will myself personally rate Julia Mutis, Alessandro's wife. For me, she is up there with Edda D'Alorso. She's a little bit different. Edda would rise above the soundtracks. She could go way over the top, whereas Julia got into the instrumentation. She was a completely different type of vocalist. So Alessandro was very canny about when and who to use, when and how. So basically that makes the nucleus of the musicians for the soundtrack up. And I wanted to just explain them before going into the soundtrack, because then you know what I'm talking about basically and who's who, you know, because I'm going to try and bring out who's done what and who's collaborated what within the soundtrack and where they've come in and stuff like that. It's actually worth mentioning that where I think Morricone really towers above everybody was his intuitive skill to match sounds, not just music, but sounds to imagery. This was very much his calling card. So I would say that Nicolai and Alessandro learnt a lot from Morricone in where to place your sounds. Morricone, and when you see the film, was a whiz, a total natural at placing sounds where, when and how, and he was an absolute genius at doing that. That was something those guys definitely picked up on. We'll look at one composition that I think is kind of classic kind of Morricone, where he's placed a sound into the film and it's actually telling its own story. It's actually telling its own narrative. It's telling us something about the story and the characters just in a sound. This was his genius. So there was a scene in Once Upon a Time in the West where the character of harmonica, played by Giles Bronson, meets Cheyenne, played by Jason Robards, for the first time in a beaten up old kind of tavern in the middle of the desert. Now, we don't see harmonica, but we hear him because he's playing a discordant sound on his harmonica. As people know in the movie, you know, that was his character, and he has the harmonica around his neck. So we already know that this is a, you know, that there's already tension between these two characters, and that when Robards is trying to speak with the harmonica character, all he's doing is he's actually blowing on the harmonica, and he's doing it in kind of a disjointed way. Now already that's telling you a story about the characters already, particularly Bronson's character. That was Morricone's genius. He would actually bring so much to the table there. And now Leone understood that. And I'll give you an example of the high kind of respect that Leone had for Morricone. When they were filming Once Upon a Time in America, Morricone composed the music first, and they had the music blaring loud on set to get everyone into part. So you had, you know, heavyweights like Robert De Niro and James Woods emoting psychologically and physically to the music on set. Now, I don't know any other composer where that compliment has been given, and certainly the practice was unheard of when Once Upon a Time in America was made. So that's kind of like at that period of his time where how respected Morricone was, and the trust was there, where, you know, you could just let him get on with it. Morricone could read a script and do the music, and that is saying something. And that's something where I think really where his genius really comes into the fore, that sixth sense that he has. What we'll do is let's talk a little bit about the soundtrack to Forbidden Photos of a Lady Under Suspicion. It's an interesting movie actually, because it's very much caught in between different time scales. We've had, like, for the last several years in Italy, very kind of erotic thrillers like Amok, and thrillers of that ilk. Yes, you could call them gialli, but they're more kind of sexy erotica, you know, whereas we get into the 70s and suddenly giallis take a very dark turn. Movies like Aldo Lado's Short Night at the Glass Dolls and Who Saw Her Die, also composed and recorded by the Big Three. So the movie itself is kind of in between. It's an interesting soundtrack. You've got kind of the jazz and you've got kind of that easy listening sound that reflects the movie, but you've also got darker soundscapes coming in to the fore, which we will discuss. So we'll talk about the main theme. There are three main themes, I would say, to this film that are recurring throughout the film. They're used intermittently throughout the movie and repeated. If you really wanted to have, I would say, a proper immersive experience of the soundtrack, then, you know, either pick up the vinyl or the CD, put your headphones on, because the tracks are in their entirety and you have a completely different listening experience when you listen to these tracks in particular. So we'll start with the first main title theme to the movie, which for all intents and purposes is a riff on bossa nova. Now, the great Italian soundtrack historian Robert Zamora has said that the soundtrack to the film, and particularly the theme, is based and a tribute to the works of Antonio Carlos Jobim, who was a Brazilian bossa nova artist. Now, he had a huge hit in 1962 with The Girl from Ipanema. It was a massive worldwide hit, particularly in Europe, where there was a bossa nova craze. So the soundtrack has been definitely utilising the bossa sound. It's not the first Italian soundtrack to use the bossa nova kind of instrumentation, but it's relevant on this particular movie soundtrack because the way that all three musicians play around with the bossa nova conventions. It's not a straight bossa nova track. For instance, the title theme is very, the rhythm's very slowed down. It's a very sort of slowed down kind of bossa nova rhythm. So when we first hear the soundtrack, it's actually the very beginning of the movie. And we see Dagmar Lysander's character, Minu, having kind of a conversation with herself about, you know, quite interestingly, in the first few lines saying she's going to give tranquilizers up. So that's obviously telling us that this is a very kind of vulnerable individual. You know, and it's also saying that although she's very beautiful and sophisticated, her inner psyche, there is obviously, there's things obviously going on, particularly with her marriage, and as she says herself, that she appears to be controlled. She's under control from her husband, and she wants to be controlled. So the soundtrack is it's interesting because she's giving you her life story, and the music weaves in and out of her voiceover. Now, whether or not that was deliberate or not on the behalf of Lucio Colli, the director, I'm not sure. Appears to me that I think it was probably something that was just done in the studio at the time. Look, you know, we've got to put the music down a little bit when we've got the voiceover, and then when there's no voiceover, we'll bring it up on the mixer again. But anyway, even if it's by default, it really works. It really kind of, it does actually kind of sort of set the tone for the film, as she tells us her story while she's in her lovely plush home. She's got beautiful architecture around her, she's beautifully, immaculately dressed, but there's something wrong. And I like the idea that, at the beginning of some of these movies, you get a lot of these, beautiful ladies and actresses, they're doing window shopping, for instance. You see them wandering around Rome and they're looking in the window and they're looking beautiful with their hats and their fantastic clothes and their Rochetti wigs. And I quite like the beginning when all of a sudden you've got this track going on and it's being actually utilised for telling you about this character even before the film starts. So you've got a very, very good idea of, kind of what's going to happen to this character. It's very, very clever. And I will mention that the theme turns up again throughout the film, and there's one scene I really do like where it's used, where Minou is with her friend Dominique, played by Nise Navarro, aka Susan Scott, who was wife to the director, made quite a few movies with him. And she plays her kind of mysterious friend Dominique, and Dominique brings some sexy pornographic pictures over for them to look at. And they're looking at the pictures, and obviously they're discussing the sexy stills, and the music's there. It's a great accompaniment to the scene because it's quite sleazy, and then we actually get to a photograph of somebody that Minou recognises, and it's the person who has been blackmailing her, played by the great Simon Andrew, who used to play kind of creepy Lotharios, and he's brilliant in the film. And she looks at the picture, and ordinarily what would usually happen with these movies would be that as soon as she sees the picture of this guy who's blackmailing her, that it will change very quickly and you'll probably go into a more sinister, suspenseful cue. But I like the idea that the cue continues, the music continues, the music looks on a distressed face, and it's still a light track. And I actually quite like the way that's been put together. It's different. In the end, the cue does arrive where it more sinister kind of composition comes up, and you get these strings well up on the soundtrack, but it's sustained, and I really like. It's a nice way that it's been put together. You have to remember that when they were making these movies, they were really churned out really quickly. Everybody was on like a red light, and the fact that they, by default or not, some really nice little nuances could come across between the soundtrack and the imagery. And I think the main theme is used really, really particularly well and usefully in the soundtrack. It's telling its own story as well. It's not just a nice groovy tune for just to because it's a window dressing. You've got the beautiful sets and the beautiful people. So no, it's a really nice theme. So let's talk about the next musical passage that counterpoints the movie, and this is a much darker passage. This is a track called "In the Void," which I really like that title. This theme is used predominantly between the interaction and the psychosexual dynamics between Minou and her blackmailer. The blackmailer in the movie is a particular sleazy slimeball, and he gets Minou to basically have sex with him in a very perverse way. We're not quite sure if it's against her will or not, but the movie uses the theme of "In the Void" during their more sadistic sexual encounters. For instance, we have a scene where the blackmailer ties Minou's hands up, and she doesn't seem to be enjoying it very much. And there's something very physical about the scene, and something taboo and dangerous, but exciting. So the track weighs in with a lot of distressed strings, courtesy of the great Dino Asciola, who was Ennio Morricone's to-go-to violinist. Wonderfully plucked, detuned strings there. Very much a lot of German serialism coming through on this track and with Asciola. We have Alessandro on accordion, again detuned and quite nasty and quite sadistic kind of sounds coming from the accordion, plus Alessandro on guitar. I think he's on mandolin as well on that track, again detuned, getting incredible crazy sounds from his guitar. One thing I let into a little secret, I'm sure Alessandro would never mind. Alessandro never used to use a pedal, and I've seen him in action on a guitar. When he performed with us for Jigoku, I always used to keep an eye on what he was doing. I always monitored Alessandro because he was fascinating to watch. We were doing a track, and it was kind of an electro rock kind of soundtrack thing, an edit I put together with my Jigoku partner Cherry Stones for Alessandro. Well, it wasn't actually for Alessandro actually. We expected him to come on the track after and start performing with us and plug his Fender in and do his thing, but he actually came on early. I think he'd had a few drinks. He'd had a few drinks before the gig, and he wandered on, and as we were putting the track together, remember this track was a heavy fuck off track. It was quite electro-y, kind of electro rock. It was used for the soundtrack to the movie The Day of Violence, so it was a pretty narky track. Now he just came on and plugged in and just started improvising, which was wonderful. And you know, I turned, I didn't know he was doing it, and I turned to Gareth, to Cherry Stones, and I was like, what the fuck's going on? You know, we turned around, and he crooked his Fender, and he was sliding it and getting these incredibly nasty feedback, and just, it sounded like a real like electronic instrument. And I said to Gareth, I said, those are fucking pedals, man. You know, we looked down and there were no pedals. And he was getting these incredible sounds from a Fender, which generally speaking, a Fender is probably one of those kind of guitars where generally people look at a Fender and think you can't get much out of a Fender. You know, it's not one of those guitars, but Alessandro could. So he, obviously learning again from the maestro, I'm pretty sure, of how to detune and stuff. That was fantastic. He was still doing that back then, and it was all intuitively as well. So we have Alessandro doing all that kind of business on the soundtrack, accordion and guitar. We have Nikolai on the organ and the piano, again extremely detuned, alongside Masciola, who is some crazy scraping sounds are coming out. In fact, you look carefully with the film, there's a close-up of, I can't remember whose back it is, but there's a shot of a back and the fingernails going down, and Asciola's totally on the mark with the scraping of the violins. And again, that is great. You know, the intuition there is fantastic, and that is basically both Morricone and Nikolai keeping a big eye on the imagery and making sure that the imagery is counterpointing the soundtrack and giving it a three-dimensional kind of wallop, you know what I mean? The soundtrack is used intermittently throughout the film for all, pretty much all the scenes between the blackmailer and Minu. Obviously, we have to again mention Il Gruppo and their influence on this piece. And it's funny, Morricone brings his kind of what he's taken from Il Gruppo into the soundtrack. These other guys are all feeding off. It's like bees to honey, all very creative and all very equal as well. There's a kind of underlying kind of sadistic kind of undercurrent to the track, and it's something that Nikolai would roll with, Alessandro would roll with within his own soundtracks. Particularly Alessandro, he funny enough, he did a library called The Story of War, and he used the very same accordion, detuned accordion on that soundtrack. And when Bruno Nicolai was doing his own compositions for his Gemelli label, I hear a lot of those organ sounds and a lot of kind of, you know, a lot of that composition going on as well, and on his piano playing on those too. So it was a very interesting hive. But funnily enough, the track, when you listen to it, if you listen to the CD on your headphones, it's about 10 minutes long. It's a really grueling track, and it really takes you on a kind of really kind of dark journey. Whereas the soundtrack, as I said, it's split into different little kind of little pockets. But it all works. So again, I can't stress enough with this soundtrack is listen to it on, you know, recorded on CD or whatever, on vinyl or Spotify, or however you want to hear it, but also listen to it on the soundtrack and how it's utilised. It's very interesting because when you've not got the imagery, it brings up a lot of imagery anyway, you know. It's a very, very kind of interesting track, and it was kind of early doors for that kind of Baroque, you know, chamber piece to be used in a giallo. So it's a little bit ahead of its time as well, you know. These guys were improvising, experimenting, and testing the waters as well. So you have to actually, this, you know, is definitely, most definitely a soundtrack that they were experimenting. It's worth mentioning that also, you know, as I said, these guys were just knocking so many soundtracks out that I'm sure the sessions just melded into one. But again, they would always give 110%, and they would always, you know, give a three-dimensional patina to the soundtrack. And the soundtrack to this movie is, you know, exactly the same, and particularly on this track. All of the big three totally on point. The third, and in a way final, musical passage of the soundtrack, it's my personal favourite. I think it's the standout track in the film. It's called Love as Pain. Fuck me, that's a name for a track already, isn't it? Yeah, it's already got an incredible name. So again, the track is used sporadically throughout throughout the movie. So it's basically, it takes elements from the main theme, but really fucks with it. So there's a bossa refrain going on, but Morricone and Nicolai and Alessandroni are really playing with the rhythms and taking it somewhere else. It's a quite haunting, romantic piece of music, but it's also edgy, uneasy, quite psychedelic, and it also really underpins, for me personally, the character of Minou and her vulnerability and the situation that she's in. Now, the piece of music is also derived from a previous soundtrack by the Big Three called The Invisible Woman. And this movie was released in 1969, a year before, but I'm pretty sure that it was the same sessions. I'm pretty sure, because they've appropriated some cues off that soundtrack for this track, and they've interwoven it into this composition as well. So basically what we have is a kind of a nice, mellow, very emotive, I wouldn't call it easy listening, I would call it a beautiful piece, I think, with lovely strings from Dino Asciola, cutting strings, and Alessandro on Fender, Morricone on trumpet, Bruno Nicolai on piano. So for me personally, this is where the Big Three, they come together. They're really congealing on this track. Let's talk about the scene, I think, that really best utilises this piece of music. It is the scene where Minou goes to meet her blackmailer for the first time. Now, even before the music started, we have the character walking down a street, and it's she's looking fantastic. She's got amazing clothes on and a headscarf, and she's looking immaculate. But her background is very ghettoised. She's in a very, very kind of unsalubrious street. So you can already feel that she's somewhat out of her comfort zone. And that already is already telling you that there's something uneasy going on. We've got some different dynamics, coming together visually. The piece starts when she arrives at the apartment. And again, it's taken from a middle part of the track where we have Nicolai's piano, and we have a wonderful, very light drum scat, bossa scat, and we have a very, very subtle keyboard and violin. And as she starts to ascend the stairs, it gets quicker, and you're feeling her unease. So she enters this building and it's a massive staircase. So she cautiously walks up the staircase. As she walks up, we get a lot of point of view shots of her and what she's seeing. We're seeing suddenly she's in an environment where there's lots of shadows and semi-darkness, and the musical piece is perfectly complements probably the feeling she's having of danger, trepidation, fear and excitement, because obviously there's a sexual attraction obviously going on between her and her blackmailer, very Hitchcockian. So as she's ascending the stairs, the pattern speeds up, but then it comes back again. They bring it back, they slow it down, and then the rhythm starts again and it starts to build. Beautifully put together. It's a genius piece of compositional composing. I will say, I think Bruno Nicolai owns this track, personally. Although we've got Alessandro and we've got Morricone definitely in there, and the great Dino Asciola, violinist. I will say that Nicolai owns this track because they're working around this stuttering piano refrain. Now, if you listen carefully and you listen to the soundtrack on CD or on vinyl, you'll hear again that he uses quite a fast technique on the pianos. It's very stuttering and juddering. It almost becomes like dub. He's actually creating an effect. And again, these guys didn't use pedals or effects units. It was a very organic trio. So, you know, Nicolai's genius is already coming out in this track. You can sense that he's leading this cue and the guys are following, most certainly. Particularly as she ascends the stairs and becomes more nervy and the track starts to build and build. It's a genius piece of soundtrack composing. Till she gets to the top of the stairs and we're at a crescendo. And there's this fantastic scene where they keep, everything is now cooking. You know, you have Nicolai's piano is juddering away. The scat is very, very, very stark. The rhythm is very, very fast. It's getting a lot faster, like her heartbeat. You know, that's how I see it. It's a very physical track, but still subtle and delicate. It's still controlled, very controlled. And then she takes a tranquilizer before knocking on the blackmailer's door. I think that's a genius. And they keep the track going. And that gives it a wonderfully edgy resonance. And when she enters the room, total darkness, suddenly we're in the world of film noir. And the track suddenly comes back down again. And again, there's a wonderful, wonderful kind of slowing of the instruments, including the violin, when she arrives at these wonderful red curtains. And by this time, it's Dino Asciola's violin is just so deep. He's gone into this totally deep jam, really, and all of a sudden everything has become very deep and very sexual. I would say the scene is very Lynchian. You know, it reminds me very much of like a David Lynch movie with those curtains. And it's wonderful how the big three are able to maintain that suspense in the movie alongside the incredible cinematography from Alejandro Uola, who was a Spanish DOP. Beautifully shot too from him. So she enters the room and there are these very strange, bizarre and Baroque porcelain hands on the walls and these porcelain kind of like masks, which further adds to the mystery and the suspense. And again, the cue is totally on point and carries on as she's looking around and looking at her surroundings, enveloped by this kind of strange, dark and forbidden film noir world. Funnily enough, the cue ends very quickly, very suddenly, when the blackmailer comes from behind and he takes her scarf and pulls himself towards her, and then it cuts. And I kind of like the way that's done. It's almost like a relief. The track has been building and building to this crescendo and they finally meet. And for me, I think that's the best cue in the movie. I think that it's not just a piece of music, it's actually adding to the narrative. I'm a great believer in the soundtrack telling a story, and that was something the big three were geniuses at. Again, bringing a three-dimensional force to the soundtrack, the sounds, alongside the imagery. But for me, that's an incredible passage, and for me, that's my favourite piece of music on the soundtrack. Let's reflect upon the soundtrack and its importance within the career of Morricone, Alessandroni, and Nicolai. Technically speaking, this is quite a lost soundtrack, and let's just talk about the period it was made in 1970. It wasn't really given a lot of respect several decades ago, because I've been collecting soundtracks since I was a little boy in the 70s. So, you know, anything with Ennio Morricone's name on I would buy. It didn't matter what it was. From very early on, I really liked the weird stuff, and I liked the different stuff. I love the spaghetti westerns, of course. It's in my DNA. But I liked all the other compositions that Ennio Morricone was putting together. Now, I'll give you a good example of, maybe it's a bit of snobbery, I don't know what, but how he was ignored. This period was ignored for a long time. There was a BBC documentary on Ennio Morricone in the 80s. It was a big documentary, actually. And they discussed the Dollars trilogy and Once Upon a Time in the West. Lots of time was spent on that. Rightly so as well, they're all classic soundtracks. But then, for some reason, you know, fucking hell, we fast forward 22 years to The Mission. And it's The Mission that is this, you know, next significant major step in Morricone's career. Now, I'm not knocking The Mission because it's an amazing score. Should have got the Oscar that year as well. But what happens to that 22 years? Yeah, just hold the phone, Rasta. You know what I'm saying? You can't just bury that 22 years. And if I remember rightly, on the documentary, they called it the Wilderness Years, and that Morricone was just repeating himself, which is absolute load of bollocks. But then you had a different school, and maybe a very academic school of aficionados there that didn't understand. And I can accept that. They're wrong and incorrect, but I can accept it. That's their thought processes, and at the time, these soundtracks weren't on radar. You know, I would say, you know, between say Once Upon a Time in the West to The Mission, it was some of the most creative work that these guys were doing, you know, and I'm not just talking about horror, I'm talking about, you know, their compositions on many genres, you know, the Italian crime thrillers, you know, dramas, romantic movies, the lot, you know, and all the library work that they were doing. You know, it's only now in the last kind of like 10 years that a mantle has been put up and we've put a microscope over this very important period, you know, thank God. So on reflection, this is, you know, most certainly one of the most, I think, significant periods of the big three, you know, particularly creatively and with experimentation and what they were going to go on to do next. You know, it's very sad back then that there was this kind of academic dismissal. But I think the same you can be of the films too. You have to remember that a lot of horror movies, they were spat upon back in those days. They weren't seen as significant. It was seen as trash, some kind of sort of exploitation, nonsense trash, which is just not true. And I think it's taken a new generation of fans, film and soundtrack aficionados, to pick the mantle up and put a microscope under some of the magnificent work that the big three, you know, the big three accomplished, you know. But I think it's mainly really important to, you know, never underestimate, of course, the great maestro Ennio Morricone. He is a living legend. There's no two ways about it. But, you know, do not forget his team. And I will not call them backup. His backup musicians, particularly Alessandro and Bruno Nicolai. These were geniuses in their own right. It's just in the world of Italian publishing, you have to have a name, and Morricone had one. So you're going to have Morricone's name on a load of soundtracks where he may not have, had a lot to do with them, because Morricone sold records. I'll give you an example of that. Nico Fidenko, who is a figure, his name has been put under many, movie soundtracks, westerns, particularly a lot of the horror movies, the sex horror films that Joe D'Amato put out. But he wasn't Nico Fidenko. The guy was a singer. He wasn't a composer. But he sold records. So his name was put on a lot of soundtracks. The soundtracks to things like Porno Holocaust and Emmanuel and The Slave Traders and all these films. It wasn't Nico Fidenko. It was actually Giacomo Dell'Orso, who was Eda Dell'Orso's husband. He was the person behind those soundtracks. But because Nico Fidenko sold records, Nico Fidenko's name was put on, everything. So it's taken years and years for people to kind of catch up with that. I'm not underestimating someone like Nico Fidenko, because he's brilliant in his own right. But really, this is it. You've got all these unsound geniuses out there that don't get any props. And I sort of feel, compelled to put a spotlight under them, because these people, should have more respect and more standing, including Alessandro, and I would say particularly Bruno Nicolai. So if there's anything to take out of the soundtrack of this film, it would be that we've got the big three here, and when you hear all these soundtracks, don't forget the other two guys as well, because really Morricone would have nowhere near have been able to put these compositions together without the input and the creativity of Bruno Nicolai and Alessandro Alessandroni.